Very much, Bill. Well, hey, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be here with you, and it's good to have such a phenomenal crowd on hand for this. I know that in these times, my worlds have been turned upside down, and but it's nice that we can focus and come together and talk about some IPT stuff. Okay, so here we go. So just to give you a quick update, the upcoming NASMA webinar scheduled for April 15th, that will be presented by Bob Ribaglia, if I have his name right, with USDA Forest Service on invasive bark and ambrosia beetles, their impacts and detection. Strongly encourage you to jump in for that one, as I know it will be an excellent talk. Okay, all of you, or many of you, have been to or seen a lot of different teachings and trainings and PowerPoints on IPT stuff. However, it's often presented in somewhat superficially in a superficial manner, and you don't get enough depth within that. And so I've really started to move toward what I call deep dives on IPT techniques. And this is where we try to leave no stone unturned and really lay out a lot of technical aspects and foundational and context, basically, that you may have never seen before. Some of this is old news. It's very simple and straightforward. Others you might be like, wow, I hadn't heard that before. But overall, this really gives you a little bit deeper understanding about IPT. Now today, I'm going to focus on basal bark herbicide treatment, and that is one IPT technique. But what I promise you is I'm going to do this in future webinars for basically the other IPT techniques like cut, stump, hack, and squirt, foliar treatments, even non-chemical methods for hand pulling and things like that. So I promise you that we will be covering those in future webinars with NASMA. I'm excited about that. Probably look for those this fall. But today, let's talk about basal bark work. Okay, so everyone's seen a picture like this, seen a slide like this, and I'll read it through it. What do we mean by basal bark treatment? Basal bark herbicide treatment is an oil-soluble herbicide mixed with an oil carrier that is applied to the entire circumference of woody stems to a height of 12 to 18 inches from the ground up for stems less than 6 inches in diameter. Now, that sounds pretty good. The reality is it's a little bit, it's kind of a weak definition from a technical standpoint, because there's a whole lot to everything that I have in bold and italicized here. There's a lot more details that presenters often do not give when really going into what basal bark application is all about. And that's what I'm going to do today. So my goals are really to help you understand those complexities, because I know you want to learn this to train your crews, that you're getting good efficacy and good efficiency in your time management, and maintaining or improving applicator safety as always, and really just having increased confidence in the techniques of IPT, and especially for today, basal bark application. Okay, now throughout this talk, I got to lay out this this caveat here that the use of trade names does not constitute UF endorsement, but I'm using them really for clarity because they truly have become part of the herbicide lingo. And so if you hear me use trade names, a lot of them have historical context, not a whole lot of products in the basal bark realm. And so we have, as applicators and extension specialists and land managers, we have used these things interchangeably. So you'll actually see me doing that some today. Okay, so the technical aspects we'll dig into today. Number 1, targets. Number 2, tools. 3, the oil carriers. 4, herbicides you might use. 5, what are good timings and bad timings. And 6, of course, as always, non-target injury type issues. Okay, so we're going to dig into all of these. So here's some things I'm not going to cover today. And these are streamlined basal bark treatments. If you've heard of that, it's for suppression of basically hardwoods for conifer release in southern states. You'll see that on the Garlon 4 Ultra label. Low volume stem bark band treatments. It just doesn't work good for prolific resprouters. And so I'm not going to get into that. And dormant stem broadcast applications, which really gets away from the intent of basal bark in my book. And of course, thin line basal management, which is going to require a whole lot more, really its own talk to get into that one. These are really highly regional things, and they're very technically nuanced. And I can't really get into these. I've already got an hour's worth of material here, but if you want to discuss them with me or have questions, be sure to email me, and we can get into those later, okay? So let's get started here. All right. So targets. So where is basal bark treatment utilized? So if you look at this table, we have invasive plant types of herbaceous vines, shrubs, and trees. And we have our IPT techniques of backpack foliar, cut stump, basal bark, and hack and squirt. What you'll see, number one, basal bark is absolutely not used for herbaceous weed control. So do not use this as a foliar treatment in any form, shape, or fashion. That is an extremely high concentration of herbicide you're using, and don't do it. It's not approved. We can use basal bark on woody vines in some cases, and we definitely use it on shrubs and trees. So the bottom line here is species that are woody is where we are utilizing basal bark type treatments. All right, so when you think about targets, there's actually a whole lot to break down here. We're going to talk some tree anatomy. We're going to talk size of individuals, talking about some discussion on diameter at breast height concepts, root collar diameter. What's the benefit? What's the difference in those? Why are they important? Where'd they come from? Heights of stems to treat. There's questions about that come up sometimes. And density, number of stems per acre. How many stems can we get away with this on a per acre basis? Okay. Let's go back to some classic silviculture, classic forestry, classic wood anatomy here. When we look at this old textbook version of tree anatomy and the target area for basal bark treatment, before I get into the basal bark, let's just go through tree anatomy. So if we start with the outer bark here, everyone knows that that's the visible portion of the bark. The rhizome is another technical term for that, but we'll stick with outer bark. The inner bark, also called the phloem. And we know that the phloem is that conducting tissue that transports photosynthates produced, through the leaves, throughout the plants to the sinks, those areas where growth is occurring in a source-sink relationship. So it's where the sugars, it's how the energy gets moved in the tree. Just within that is the cambium, and this is the meristematic tissue that produces new phloem to the outside and new sapwood or xylem to the inside, resulting in the growth rings. So the sapwood is our xylem, and that are the water conducting tissue that moves water up from the roots through the woody stems up to the leaves, where it is subsequently lost through transpiration as part of the gas exchange that occurs for photosynthesis. Within that is the heartwood, and we like to say that this is the non-useful parts, especially when it comes to any type of herbicide type work. And so we ignore this completely. Anyone who suggests you need to drill all the way into the middle of the tree, strongly disagree with that in most cases, because all the action is going to be occurring in this area right here, okay? From the phloem, the cambium, and possibly into the sapwood. Now for basal bark application, here we go. We just sprayed the outside of that outer bark. So we've got our oil herbicide mixture here. You can see that band in kind of that yellowish brown. And that oil is able to penetrate the bark. It moves through it, and the herbicide is carried with it, and it will penetrate to the inner bark of the phloem so that the herbicide can then be moved into the phloem itself. And it will also penetrate through the phloem all the way into the cambium, which is where it really begins to do its damage in terms of destroying the ability of that tree to produce new xylem and phloem. And some herbicide can actually move through the cambium all the way into the sapwood itself. So basal bark wise, primarily our target area is getting that herbicide into the phloem so that we get good translocation and movement to the sinks, and hopefully when we're doing it in the fall, that we can get it to translocate down into the roots and into the cambium to destroy that meristematic tissue, which will completely kill those stems, okay? So this is what we want. Now, moving on, what about tree target size? So that basic definition said trees less than 6 inches in diameter at breast height, or DBH. Years ago, Les Meerhoff took a great picture here where he captured an incredible diversity of tree sizes within this one picture. May have not been his intent, but as soon as I saw this, I picked up on it, and I've used this ever since. Here we have a tree of less than 2 inches in diameter, DBH. Here we have one that's slightly less than 4 inches in diameter. That one's about 3. And here we have one that's slightly less than 6 inches in diameter. And then, of course, we have some much bigger individuals, 8 to 10 inches in diameter that you see in these pictures too. So basal bark truly is targeting some definite smaller size classes within woody plants in general. Okay, so keep that in mind, but let's get into it a little bit more. You have probably seen stuff on DBH, diameter at breast height. You've seen stuff on RCD, root collar diameter, or possibly basal area. Okay, so on a lot of extension publications, you will see something about doing basal bark on trees less than 6 inches DBH. Okay, that's a diameter at breast height at 4.5 feet. It's easy to do on single stemmed individuals. This was really developed with silviculture in mind. It was developed for silviculture that foresters as a way of beginning to quantify and measure their stands. It was applied through forestry weed science for the management of undesirable woody vegetation, primarily undesirable hardwoods, both within pine silviculture and hardwood silviculture. And it has subsequently been carried into invasive plant management, so you will still see the term thrown out there for invasive plant management extension publications, okay? So it's useful, it's good, there's no problem with it. And there's a lot of the historic data supports this of solely going by DBHs. Now you will notice it's easy to do DBH on single stemmed individuals. When you get into multi-stems, it gets a lot more complicated and confusing regarding basal bark application. Root collar diameter, AKA basal diameter, which you've seen, this is the measured diameter just above ground level. So basically getting some sort of measurement. What is the size of that stem or woody individual just above the ground level surface, okay? Now, this quickly gets complex for invasive shrubs and trees, which most of us deal with, because rarely do we have perfect stands of single-stemmed invasive plants. And a colleague, Natalie Van Dorn from the USDA Forest Service, had published a paper looking at root collar diameters, but she was doing it more from an allometric equation, goal of developing allometric equations for measuring forest productivity. But in this case, I just want to take these pictures to show you often the variation that you will see in so many invasive plants in terms of a root collar diameter. We can see a nice simple one here. We can see swollen bases that complicate it just a little bit. We can see these that begin to branch and fork at varying heights, like numbers 3 and 4 here. We can see number 5 where suddenly we've got additional stems popping up from just below the soil surface that are clearly attached and connected. And then finally, those that are almost branching or dividing, branching right at just at ground level there. So don't worry about the text within these slides for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, but just understand that I'm sure if you think about it, you can all quickly relate, and having dealt with many woody invasive plants exhibiting a multitude of these types of growth forms. So these also sort of make root collar diameter get a little complex too, okay? So bark thickness comes into this equation for sure in regarding either DBH or RCD or basal diameters, okay? So let's talk about bark thickness. Early studies indicated that trees greater than 6 inches DBH had bark that was just too thick for the oil to penetrate. So how did they figure this out? They went out and sprayed a bunch of different size trees, and the ones all under 6 inches tended to die a whole lot better than anything above 6 inches where they saw very little activity. And that was historically done largely with 2,4-D, and then moved into triclopyr, and then they got into the soil residuals like picloram, and then much later things like imazapyr. But the bottom line was the rule of thumb came about pretty quickly. These trees that are greater than 6 inches, they have this apparently thicker bark, and we just can't get the oil to penetrate that. And so that's kind of the way it's always been. Now, they also found that when you got into trees that were in the 4 to 6 inch DBH range, this was where they started to see a lot more variation, both in bark thickness and among species, and in the efficacy or consistency and control. So things that were extremely fast growing, bark thickness was often not a problem, as they were very thin barked or thin skinned species. However, very slow growing species, even the 4-inch diameter ones, would actually be a whole lot older than you might think, and had already put on pretty significant outer bark at that point. Then there are occasional species that don't respond like this at all, and they're hard to kill no matter what their size is. In Florida, things like lead tree, even 2-inch diameter trees can be very difficult. Melaleuca, just about any size are going to be very difficult with basal bark applications. Many native oak trees, especially, very long-lived, slow-growing, that put on thick bark. We have found from the silvicultural world that they are hard to control even at 4 inches in diameter, and some down 2 to 4 inches being difficult. So keep bark thickness in mind here. And again, look at these pictures. Smooth, thin bark, definitely easier for oils to penetrate. You get better coverage as you apply the oil herbicide mix. And on very smooth bark, the oil tends to quote unquote wrap around the stems even a little bit better. So the oil, based upon its properties, will spread and move so that you get really, really good coverage with smooth, thin bark. So you get good coverage and good penetration. Ridged, platy bark, like the picture on the right here, it's much tougher to get really good coverage. It's tougher to penetrate. It's so thick, the oil gets tied up in it, and it's just unable to move through the bark. And subsequently, the herbicide also cannot move through the bark either. So this bark thickness thing is one of the Achilles heels for a lot of woody invasive plants, which is good news for us because they're so fast growing and typically shorter lived species that they don't put on super thick bark. Now here in Florida, of course, we have a lot of fast growing tropical type trees that make this again more challenging. But overall, when you assess just visually looking at a stem and you see bark like this, there's typically a better chance that basal bark's going to work. Stems like this, there's a better chance that there's going to be a little more struggle with efficacy, headed towards downright failure the thicker this is. Okay, so here's a nasty situation, of course. We don't deal with single stemmed individuals in a lot of cases. We've got these crazy multi-stem complexes, and here you have one that you've got very small stems, you've got medium sized, and you've got some gigantic ones that are all part of this one individual. Okay, so DBH, how are you going to take it? Does it even matter? Does root collar diameter matter in situations like these? Well, first off, the sums of individual stems in here is really not necessary because you're going to come up with some giant number. And if you go around telling people that you were treating things with a cumulative DBH of 30 inches with basal bark, they're going to look at you and think you're crazy. However, when we start breaking down individual stem type situations, we find that we can have some usefulness in these. So in this clump, each stem is less than 6 inches in diameter, and the stems are independent. So this is one of those examples where they're all emerging literally right at the ground level, and they're independent, they haven't grown together, and this is a situation where basal bark will work extremely well. Now you do have to get all these little, what I call whippets, these very small stems coming off of tiny lateral roots right at the base of the root collar. So they have to be treated along with the bigger stems. And these internal or interior stems are usually where it is the most challenging to get good coverage with basal bark application. But overall, when the stems are sort of separate like this, this is a great scenario where basal bark can work on relatively big individuals that would have a huge root collar diameter that are technically smaller DBH measurements for each individual stem. Okay, here's another really interesting example. Same species. This is also, the last one was Chinese privet. This is also Chinese privet. And what you can see in this case is each stem is less than 6 inches DBH. But in this case, the stems have grown together. So there's some fusion that's occurred there. And also, again, a very large root collar diameter. So here's a scenario where treating the lower 12 to 18 inches, you may or may not actually be able to get inside of these stems that have fused together. And this presents a potential problem in terms of bark inclusions that may be actually on the insides of these stems. Sort of bark inclusions that may go to nowhere, or bark inclusions that you can't even get to, that are still viable tissue that could result in resprouting down the road. Okay, so we have seen very good control even on species that have a larger than 6-inch diameter root collar here, where the DBHs are all definitely less than 6 inches, even where there's some fusions here. But just recognize that once things start to fuse together, this is where things start to get difficult with basal bark applications, or more challenging for sure. Okay, now what about basal treatment in this situation? And of course, I'm here in Florida, and this is one of the ones we struggle with, Brazilian pepper tree, where you have a single individual of sprawling stems all coming from a base root crown. Many are laying prostrate on the ground. They're huge. There's some 12 to 15-inch diameter there in the back. There's some smaller, 4 to 6 in the front. You know, and look at the thickness of the bark in this situation too. This is like a nightmare for applicators down here. So in this clump, each stem is greater than 6 inches for the most part. Stems have grown together, so we've got bark inclusions there, and the bark is deeply ridged. This is really where basal bark is not going to work, and you're going to have to go to a different type approach. Okay, moving on here. We say treat the lower 12 to 15 inches. That's what the current, a lot of the triclopyr ester labels say, 12 to 15 inches. The imazapyr labels, the aminocyclopyr labels say 12 to 18 inches of every stem. So basically what we're talking about is spraying that herbicide oil mix and getting good coverage all the way around each stem to a height that is, in this case, this is exactly 12 inches because I measured it. Okay, so this is sort of the minimum for that we're talking about in terms of basal bark application. Now, why is there a range in heights? Why do we say 12 to 15 or 12 to 18? Okay, this is really, it's not based upon a whole lot of hardcore science as much as it gives label flexibility for the applicator. Okay, so having a range of sizes is necessary because perfection of treating at a single height is nearly impossible in most conditions, and applicators are just not going to be able to do it. So you can train applicators very well to get out there and quickly ascertain a range of 12 to 18 inches so that they're somewhere there getting good coverage all the way around all stems. Now, it also allows applicators to begin to self-adjust across species and target sizes and conditions. As we recognize there's going to be some variation in sensitivity among species and the way they grow and their bark thicknesses and everything, so that when you are really going after a single species on the job, you can begin to tailor bark heights with more and more experience, or tailor application heights with more and more experience based upon the size of the individuals. So that really small 1 to 2 inch diameters, cutting that application height down. The larger the diameters, typically bumping that application height up closer to 18 inches, or 15 to 18 inches for the high ends for the different herbicide labels. So that's where the range comes from. It's not from sort of any regression of height response based upon former studies, but it gives flexibility for the applicator, which we definitely need. Okay, I also mentioned before you do have to treat every stem in the clump, including these very small ones. I've seen situations where we miss treating these and the tree survives. This thing survives and produces a brand new sapling very quickly. Whereas the rest of the tree dies. So sometimes, unfortunately, I would love to be able to say, yeah, you treat all these bigger ones, treat all the bigger ones here, and you don't have to treat the smaller ones. They're going to naturally die because of good translocation. But unfortunately, we've just found that doesn't always occur. And the more prolific these root crown sprouting species are, the more important it is, I think, to treat all of those even smaller stems too. Okay, final thing on target here, general guidelines for target height and density. So we've talked about anatomy and tree size and the height of application. When we sort of step back from all that and think about an infestation that's occurring over an acre, okay, or hundreds of acres. This graph, or this was developed by a colleague of mine, and I got to give credit to Dr. Bill Klein, who was one of the pioneers of triclopyr as a basal bark herbicide application technique. He did a tremendous amount of work with that, and he shared this with me, and I've really worked on this thing and worked to break it down, and I think it makes a lot of sense, and I tend to agree with it. Basal bark, we tend to use it in situations where our woody plant height begins to exceed that which we can do with any type of backpack or directed foliar applications. Okay, so basal bark, that puts us in that range of, from somewhere around 6 feet upwards. And we have 10 feet here as sort of the top end of this thing. They can be much, much taller than that, but it's a function of that, of stem size and bark thickness at that point. But again, it shows you that we're in these things that are too tall for directed foliar, and we have now stem density on the y-axis here, and we're in the range of being below, right around, 1,500 or so stems per acre. So now that specifically is in relation to a triclopyr application. So please don't take that and go apply it to another basal bark herbicide, because that was developed for triclopyr itself. But I like to use this not to promote that, that triclopyr product, but just to show, hey, we can get away with treating about 1,500 acres per stem with a standard triclopyr ester product at 20% volume to volume in most cases. And I'm going to do the math for that with you in a little while, and you're going to see that it works out really, really nicely. Okay. Above that, we're moving into other approaches in terms of other foliar type sprays. But here's where basal bark really comes in. Okay. Now, what about basal in this situation? Is this a good or this a bad? Credit the Minnesota Department of Ag for the picture here. The species, I believe, Japanese barberry. And this is common where you have these thickets of invasive, thicket forming invasives like that. First off, when you start digging into this, you're going to have, you can have a pretty high stem density, number one, of extremely small stems, making this an incredibly challenging scenario for basal bark application. So be very careful about committing to a technique before you are intimately familiar with what the job is going to look like, because this is a situation where basal bark is going to be an absolute nightmare, especially for a species like that. That's going to be really, really a pain to walk through. Okay, here's a couple of other situations that are common. Again, very dense, thick stands, but in this case of coral ardesia, which is often single-stemmed individuals, but are very tiny. So these all stems are less than an inch in diameter, and these are really about a centimeter in diameter, 1 to 2 at max. So you've got a dense upper canopy and with single-stemmed individuals. Number one, finding each and every one of these stems, bending back the vegetation to trickle a basal bark treatment down that is going to be extraordinarily time-consuming. So if you have the time, you could technically do it, but for applicators who are really working to move through acres, it's not going to be an option. Here we have a multi-stemmed individual that are all very small, like Nandina, common Nandina, that you have a bunch, like 5 or 6 different, 2-centimeter stems here that, again, really make for a slow and meticulous basal bark type treatment, unless you are grossly over applying and literally just spraying the whole thing down here at the base, resulting in a lot of spray missing the target stems there and getting onto other vegetation or the ground itself. So these are conditions and situations where basal bark gets extremely tough, even if you're within a stem densities that we can typically use it for. Okay, now we're going to move to tools for basal bark herbicide treatment. All right. Backpacks, spray bottles, spray tips is what we'll talk about here. There's lots of different brands. I'm not advocating for specific brands. I'm just showing you different pictures here of some common brands that are out there that you begin to think about these. And probably the most important things I'm going to tell you is dedicate backpacks for basal bark work. I don't recommend using your basal bark backpacks back and forth for foliar applications. Just dedicate them for the oil herbicide mix, stick with it. Make sure they've got Viton seals, which are critical, because you're going to learn here quickly that the oil penetrant, the oil carriers that we utilize for basal bark application can be hard on your seals and hard on equipment in general. Okay. Now, if you're into backpack repair, make sure you're using backpacks that you have the ability to repair and replace seals on, especially. And so just keep that in mind. Comfort and safety, of course, we're talking about 3 to 4 gallon loads here in most cases of the oil herbicide mix, and something with really good comfortable straps, shoulder support, hip support are very important. okay? Now, get rid of the plastic wand. I gotta tell you, most backpacks often come with the plastic wand. You can put it in the toolbox for later emergencies, but I strongly recommend moving to some sort of brass wand if possible. The Cadillacs, of course, these brass tip shutoff wands, ultra low volume brass wands that are available for sale. They're very expensive, but they tend to be really, really good for basal bark. The brass tip shutoff wands really prevent dripping and leakage, which is nice, and they're heavy duty, they're very durable, and these things are so the parts, there's a bunch of parts to it, but the bottom line is you can replace just about anything on this wand relatively easily. So definitely recommend investing in some sort of brass wands. If you go the high road here, these are really the Cadillac for basal bark herbicide application. All right, the tips are important, okay? Spray tips are important for basal bark. If you send a spray crew out and they've got a wide angle spray tip on it, like a 80 degree or 110 degree, they could potentially be wasting a whole lot of spray if they were trying to do it like they were doing foliar applications. For basal bark work, we tend to move towards cone jet adjustable spray tips like this one. This is a spraying systems 5500 X3, and you can go all the way to X8, and they're really good. The adjustable cone, the adjustable spray tip shows you can go from a straight stream pattern here on the left all the way to a relatively narrow spray angle, but it gives you flexibility to make that adjustment for what you're doing. If you got something hard to reach and want to hit it with a straight stream, then you can go to that. Or when you get into the 4 to 6 inch diameter trees that you definitely want to maybe increase this a little bit. Very nice to have these types of adjustable spray tips. The other option is like a very narrow angle, like a TJet 2503 flat fan spray tip. So it's going to have a 25 degree spray angle, and the 03, the 0.3 gallons per minute delivery volume there. And again, that's going to give you a fixed 25 degree spray pattern. And so if you're really doing even aged treatments or treatments to even age invasive plant stands where everything is 4 inches in diameter, these can actually be pretty useful. But once you start to vary that size a little bit, then you start having trouble with these as you can start spraying around the sides of stems, and a lot of your spray is missing your target and going on to other species or the ground. So I kind of give these types of adjustable cone jet spray tips 5 stars in my experience. Really satisfied with them. I give these 3 stars. They can be good, but they just don't have the range of use that the adjustables do. Now, people ask me about these types of things. Can you use the smaller spray bottles for basal bark application? And again, here's a few different ones that are out there. There's super cheap ones you can pick up at the box stores, or you can tend to pick up a little bit more premium type ones like this. You can use these. You can for basal bark herbicide application. They typically are going to come with an adjustable cone tip nozzle here that will give you everything from, again, a straight stream all the way to sort of a real pretty narrow spray angle pattern. These tips are very iffy, and they can be extremely variable and somewhat questionable, especially in their consistency and any patterns they're putting out. And they're cheap, and they can get gummed up pretty easily. And so there's a lot of issues with them. So you can use these, and heck, you can even take and put basal bark oil and herbicide in these small spray bottles like this that you would use for hack and squirt. And I know applicators who do. So you can do it. These things, unfortunately, don't expect them to last very long. So these tend to fail pretty quickly when you get the herbicide oil mixes in them. And these can last a little longer, but I've still had all of these things tend to fail over time. Never ever leave spray in them where they're pressurized, because they will leak like crazy, and you will have your oil herbicide mix all over the back of your truck if you do that. Okay, so pressure is the next thing. So what kind of pressure do we need to be at? So typically we're using backpack sprayers. And if you don't have any type of inline pressure regulator on there, you know, we're typically looking at less than 10 psi. It is very, very low pressure. What you can see here is somebody who's pumped up a little sprayer way too high pressure wise, and I am blasting a straight stream out, and look at all of the herbicide oil mix that's coming off of that stem. It's incredible. So this is where low pressure, using more of a drizzle type approach, is a whole lot better for selectivity and keeping the herbicide on your target stems. So you really need to train your crews to not over pressurize and over pump their backpack sprayers, and learn to go very slowly, because this is going to be a different pumping strategy than you'll typically have for foliar applications. And you've got to really work on folks to make sure they're not over pressurizing when they're doing basal bark application, or 80% of your material is going to end up on the ground instead of on and around your stems, which means you're putting out way more volume than you would have planned for. Okay, now let's move on to oil carriers. So we have several oil carriers that are available. So historically, diesel fuel was the go-to oil carrier for basal bark herbicide treatment. Okay, so if you can believe it, it's still legal, and it is still allowable, and you'll find it on herbicide labels. But technically, you will not see it recommended. Certainly not for most universities these days. I don't recommend diesel. Just don't think it's great to put diesel into the environment. It's pretty nasty to work with, and the fumes alone will give you a nasty headache. And I don't like to put applicators in this situation, those types of situations. So it's legal, you can use it, but I don't recommend it as an oil carrier. Okay, kerosene, again, legal, but not recommended, same reasons. Okay. Now we have many bark oils, and we'll get into these just a little bit. Absolutely is what I recommend these days. Are bark oil type products. These are typically, there's an industry of, you know, of manufacturers who develop these bark oils, and are working on them specifically with basal bark herbicide application in mind. And so I really appreciate that, and the products can be very effective, and they can have pretty clear label language, and instructions for use that are extremely useful. So let's get into, some people ask, what about vegetable oils? So yeah, they can work too. So there's a lot of variation out there, and you can even see some bark oils will have vegetable oil components in them. What about used fry oils? Can I go down to McDonald's and empty out their fryers and actually mix that with triclopyr and spray it out? Well, I would say immediately, yeah, you probably can, but there's some definite caveats there. That oil quality has not been tested. There's no data on doing that really in terms of the efficacy and how that oil is going to penetrate different bark types. And what the cooking temperatures and all is doing to the oil in terms of its the properties that are going to make it a useful carrier for an herbicide. In addition, those types of restaurant oils are going to be full of gunk, and those are the types of things that can gum up a sprayer pretty fast. And so I have a hard time recommending those in a lot of cases. Some people have asked me, well, if I spray those out there, am I going to have animals coming up and licking the trees because they like the oil? Well, there's a possibility so. Mineral oils, yes, you'll find some mineral oils that are labeled for use as basal bark oils. Not a ton of them out there, I don't think, but they're out there. And things like methylated seed oils. So we use MSO, right? We use it as to add to our foliar herbicides. Now it will work, but by gosh, that's going to be a pricey alternative. When you start using the concentrations, and when you need 80% of your mix needs to be MSO, that's going to be jack the price up pretty fast. Okay, crop oil concentrates, I haven't really done, there's not been a lot of research with those, and so I tend to lean away from those. And really, at the end of the day, I lean back towards the bark oils as sort of the go-to for basal bark herbicide work. Okay, now this is from the Garlon 4 Ultra label, and it actually has a couple of statements on that that are important. I've underlined one, but here's where it says you can use kerosene or diesel fuel, or even number 1 or 2 fuel oil. Again, it's still labeled. I don't recommend it. but it makes a statement here that's important. Substitute other oils or diluents only as recommended by the oil or diluents manufacturer. And always follow the instructions and directions and precautions from that product label. And I would also take this so far as to say, look, do a compatibility test and let this thing sit for several hours and put those together and see exactly how. This is where mason jars are fantastic. Glass mason jars, put a little bit of oil, do it in a, you know, a 20% herbicide, 80% oil ratio, and see how they do. And if you can begin to see those things separate within a few hours, then that's going to be indicative that you may have some problems, even for Garlon 4, okay? Reagitation is required. And so, and actually with most of the basal bark products, I strongly recommend reagitation. So if you've mixed up a big batch and have let it set for a few days, always shake it up before distributing that to your applicators and backpacks. Okay, so how do you get basal oil? This is one of those things that people can have trouble with figuring out how to mix. Should I just mix into individual backpacks, or is there a better way to do it? Well, the good news is there is a better way to do it, and it's called short fill basal oil containers. So things like this, this is a 15-gallon container that you can buy a basal oil in, and it may come with somewhere between like 10 and 11.5 gallons of basal oil, and then a bunch of empty headspace at the top of that container. That headspace is there so you can add herbicide to it. So you can customize large batches of herbicide oil mix. So in this case, 10 gallons of oil that you buy already in the short fill with a 2.5 gallon, add a 2.5 gallon herbicide, say like triclopyr ester, and that automatically makes you a 20% volume to volume. So really nice to take and dump 2.5 gallons of herbicide directly into this, and then shake that up really well and distribute it to your applicators and backpacks, as opposed to trying to mix in individual backpacks. A lot of folks have capitalized on this and gone to smaller short fill containers. So you can see some folks out there selling even 2-gallon and 4-gallon short fills for smaller jobs. To put, you know, that will be the equivalent of adding a couple of quarts of triclopyr ester with a couple of gallons of oil to get that 20% ratio, okay? Now, when you're using these short fills, a couple of important things. Number one, they're pretty darn heavy because you're dealing with 10 to 15 gallons of liquid there, of oil herbicide mix. So just recognize that there's some weight to it, and shaking those up can be a real pain. Number two, make sure you keep the openers around. So these things typically have a nice little sort of key type opener at the top. And if you don't have one, you can typically do it with a flathead screwdriver and a hammer, or a needle nose pliers. But bottom line is, get the keys that open these things. And I recommend the dispensers too, that help you put these out into backpacks, because if you just try to pour directly out of these containers, they can get pretty messy pretty fast when you're trying to pour into a small mouthed backpack sprayer. Okay, what about dyes? So you'll see here that this bark oil blue product happens to have a blue dye already in it. Now, not all oil carriers have that. You can actually buy individual dyes, they're oil soluble colorants that you can mix with your bark oil and herbicide. Do you need them? Well, what they do is enhance visibility for sure. Just like we say with foliar, except for basal bark applications, they really, really can enhance and see what you've done. I recommend these things because I know that at the end of a long day of doing basal bark work, if I look back over here and see a stem that I've missed, or if I don't have the dye in there, I really may be questioning having to fight my way back over there and treat that thing. But now looking at it, I can see very clearly, I treated it, I got it, I got them all. So bottom line is, I like the dyes for visibility. Thanks to Lauren Pyle for that picture. Okay, now moving on to the herbicides. So what do we use for basal bark herbicide application? First off, I'm going to throw you a curveball. True or false, Milestone, which is aminopyrrolid, and Clearcast, which is a Mazamox, are labeled for basal bark treatment. I don't have a place for you to vote on this, but just think about this for a minute. You think that's true or false? We just said oil soluble herbicides for basal bark. We know Milestone is water soluble. We know Clearcast is highly water soluble. Sadly enough, the answer is true. Okay, so they actually both have label statements for use as basal bark herbicide applications. Now, previously, the companies have done a little work where they figured out specific oil carriers that Milestone was somewhat compatible with, that they could get it into, get it agitated enough to actually get it to disperse within the oil mix, and add it for things like Tree of Heaven. So triclopyr ester with milestone at like 1% milestone with the very specific oil carrier mix, I think from AccuMix maybe, that would allow you to do that, that they felt like they had enough data to suggest it reduced lateral root sprouting. Okay, so the caveats are it's a water soluble product that you have to have a special oil carrier to actually get it to really disperse within the oil. Okay, and these labels will say very clearly within those sections the basal oil should be compatible with a water soluble herbicide. So that automatically should throw up a red flag that you need a very specific product if you were going to use those. Now, you're not going to find a ton of data out there where anybody's used things like Clearcast and Milestone as basal bark herbicide applications. So there's pretty limited data in general out there, but there is enough that they put them on the label. And it's something that we in the universities have just not done a whole lot of work on. Okay, and again, I'm going to leave you with that statement on those two products. Water soluble herbicides do not penetrate bark very well. What I think is going on there is aminopyrrolid or imazamox is being applied, and it's not penetrating the bark at all, but it's actually moving down the stems with precipitation, and it is right there concentrating at the root collar of the tree where there can be a lot of soil activity with both of those herbicides. So I think what you're seeing there is a nice complementary soil activity from these herbicides when they are used as a basal bark. Okay, now the problem is when you get the wrong oil carrier, this is the type of thing that happens. This is Clearcast mixed with Impel Red oil, and Impel Red's a good product, but it's just not compatible with a water soluble herbicide like Clearcast. This stuff, you mix them together and I swear it comes out like pink cotton candy just about, and very decorative on your trees. So, you know, if you want to try this, I certainly recommend that you are very cautious, because we gummed up a whole lot of sprayers in some testing we were doing with these. Okay, so what do I recommend? Okay, now I'm going to say low volume basal treatment products, and I'm going to explain what that means after I go through these. Now, there are generics available for some, but again, the lingo is sort of embedded within the trade names along with the active ingredients. And so, again, I'm not endorsing products as much as saying really how this market has developed and what's out there. Okay, so first and foremost, triclopyr ester. That is the commercial standard for basal bark work. It is old, reliable, and it's the thing that we've been using now for over 40 years in terms of utilizing Garlon 4 and a number of additional triclopyr ester products now. So what you'll see typically are recommendations somewhere between 10 and 30%. This is on a volume to volume basis, okay? So 10 to 30% volume to volume. I will tell you 20% volume to volume really is the commercial standard. And that's sort of where we have been at and based recommendations on to get good activity on species less than 6 inches in diameter, 20% volume to volume. You'll see the label go to 30, and that's a pretty darn hot basal mix with triclopyr ester, and I haven't seen a lot of need for that in most situations. I have seen the ability to drop it down to 10%, and we've even done a heck of a job on Chinese privet cutting this down to 5% in some studies that we've published. But bottom line is really 20% is where we sort of we get to 20 and float around that a little bit. The ready-to-use version of that is called Pathfinder 2, and there's probably some generics out there also. It's 100%, you use it as is right out of the jug. So this RTU product is extremely good in terms of small jobs However, you're going to pay a premium for it. So just recognize that. Now we have a second formulation of triclopyr, the triclopyr acid. It's both oil and water soluble. And the label will tell you to be at 20.8 to 31.4% volume to volume, which is kind of some odd numbers there. But the bottom line is this is a 2.8 pound per gallon formulation, whereas the Garlon triclopyr ester is a 4 pound per gallon. And so this product is actually a pretty darn hot version of triclopyr in terms of basal bark work. And a lot of folks will actually cut that down to 10% when they're using the acid formulation. Imazapyr is another one that has been utilized chopper, 6 to 9% on a volume to volume basis with max use rate of 64 ounces per acre. I'll get to max use rates in a minute. And then Method is a newer one, minocyclopyrachlor, which is recommended for basal at 5 to 10% on a volume to volume basis. However, it's got a max use rate of 18 fluid ounces per acre, which means you're not going to be able to treat very many trees at all. Okay, so PPE for all these depends upon the labels. Okay, for Garlon 4, Pathfinder 2, and Chopper, long sleeve shirt, long pants, shoe socks, chemical resistant gloves. What's missing there? Eye protection. Holy cow. These labels do not specify eye protection when doing basal bark. Do you know what I recommend? It's okay to go over the label PPE and use eye protection. I recommend eye protection for any pesticide applications in general. Tricera adds in actual waterproof gloves instead of chemical resistant, but it does have protective eyewear because this product has a danger signal word that you need to be aware of. Okay, so if you've got folks that are used to using these products that don't even require eye protection and you shift to Tricera, recognize you're kicking it up a notch in terms of applicator safety. And it's very important to recognize that and train your people appropriately. Method, long sleeve shirt, long pants, shoes, and socks, no eye protection required there. Okay, I said conventional basal bark, or I said low volume basal bark. I got to give you a little history here. On the label, you're going to see several different basal bark applications. One is conventional and one is low volume. When we talk basal bark today, we are always talking low volume basal bark. Conventional basal bark is from a bygone era of mixing 1 to 5 gallons of Garlon 4 and 100 gallons of oil. So that's a 1 to 5%, okay? And again, spray the basal parts to a height of 12 to 15 inches, thoroughly wetting the area, spray until runoff at the ground line is noticeable, okay? So basically, what you were doing here is taking a low concentration of Garlon 4 and oil and literally puddling that around the base of the tree. You sprayed it so heavily. Applicators quickly found that they were filling backpacks way too much with this methodology and didn't like the idea of putting so much herbicide directly onto the soil itself. Low volume came along to fix that, where we're mixing 20 to 30 gallons or 20 to 30% solution and spraying 12 to 15 inches, wetting the lower stems, but not to the point of runoff, okay? That is the big difference within those, and this is where basal bark treatment has arrived. Okay, we are running out of time here, and I got a lot to cover. The max labeled rates of basal bark herbicides, this is important. We got to go through this. Tricera, actually, you can get away with 9 pounds acid equivalent triclopyr on a per acre basis. So if you were doing it at 20% volume to volume, technically that is 15.65 gallons of mix, okay? Because it's formulated product, it's up to, well, 3.13 gallons per acre, excuse me. Yeah, okay, 3.13 gallons per acre. So 9 pounds per acre is what that's going to be. So 15.65 gallon mix. For Garlon 4 Ultra, 2 gallons per acre or 8 pounds acid equivalent's the max, which means a 10 gallon mix, excuse me, well, total of 12.5 gallon mix. I got that wrong there for 20%. So we go from 15 and that should be down to 12. For chopper, it really depends upon the silvicultural operations there, but for 32 ounces of chopper, you'd be down to 3.1 gallons of mix for an 8% concentration. And for method, a 2.8 gallon mix for a 5%. So what you can see here is we go from 15 to what should be 12 to 3.1 to 2.8. Not all products are created equal, and it's very easy to go over the label with method, with chopper, and you start to become easy at really high stem densities here. You have a little more leeway here with Tricera. Why it matters, Garlon 4 at 20% volume to volume, if you're putting out 5 milliliters of that mix per 1 inch of root collar diameter when you're spraying to wet for a 12-inch wide band, that's going to mean that a 4-inch diameter tree would require 20 mils of herbicide oil mix. So if you have 37,850 to work with, divided by 20, that's 1,892 stems or trees per acre. Guess what? Right there is where that number comes from, okay? So boom, this is why we're pushing slightly over 1,500 stems per acre to do basal bark with Garlon 4. Kind of cool when you see the math add up like that, okay? Now, if you've got really bigger individuals or multi-stem clumps like this, basically 252 of these trees on a per acre basis would be all you could do, all right? So what you're treating your targets actually comes out pretty important. Timing, when can we do this? Okay, most of the year is fine. This is one we can get away with year round. Late summer through fall is often most effective as woody shrubs are allocating energy reserves into the roots. But winter's great, and winter's a really good time to do a lot of basal work. Even in cold weather, it can work well. We tend to avoid heavy sap flow in the late winter and early spring, and we definitely avoid treating soaking wet stems. Now, a little bit of dew in the morning, not as big of a deal. Treating right after a heavy rainstorm where all the stems are truly wet, it's going to be hard for the oil to want to move through that water to penetrate the bark. Snow can become a factor, but typically only when you're trying to really treat right down to the root collar, the ground line with basal bark. So when you've got a couple of feet of snow out there, basal bark is going to be a problem. Okay, can you do it in standing water? So we just said it was an oil-soluble herbicide for things like the triclopyr ester products. The label says it's permissible to treat seasonally dry wetlands, such as floodplains, deltas, marshes, swamps, or bogs, and transitional areas between upland and lowland sites where surface water is not present, except in isolated pockets due to uneven or unlevel conditions, okay? So basically, I lean away from ever using Garlon 4 in standing water. The label's giving you a little flexibility here in what's called isolated pockets of water, but the bottom line is this product is not designed to be put into water, and so I don't recommend it. And so, and seasonally dry, truly dry wetlands, okay, no problem, but once the water's up, you got a problem in my book. All right, Tricera has an aquatic label. And like Impel Red Basal Oil is labeled for aquatic use. Operationally, you can put these two together and keep treating as the water's up in wetlands. However, you're putting triclopyr directly into the water column, you are going to see non-target damage, and it ain't going to be pretty. So be very careful with this. Just because you're going to get the job done faster doesn't mean it's a great idea. Stewardship is very, very critical with this product. Non-target injury issues to finish up here. Imazapyr and aminocyclopyrachlor can definitely flash back from a basal application exuded from dead roots picked up by live trees, okay? So that can happen, okay? From root exudation, so translocation of that herbicide down to the roots die, it's released, active in the soil, other species get it. Yes, we know that can happen. Okay, root grafting, yes, it can happen, primarily only in the same species, not across species, and it's going to happen for strongly flow-immobile herbicides in general, but we can't seem to make it consistent enough to treat one individual and guarantee it will kill the other one, but you can see some injury, okay? Herbicide flashback number 3, herbicide transfer through runoff and uptake from the soil. So if you're spraying and you get a lot on the ground around your basal treated tree here, that's a lot of soil activity that's going to potentially cause some problems. Same thing we see with hack and squirt here with the Imazapyr for hack and squirt. Okay, here's a ring of death from an Imazapyr treated tree here, and what you see, it was treated with a basal treatment, and holy cow, we got a heck of a ring of death coming up around there. That was pretty bad. So bottom line is, yeah, it's real and it can happen, and you got to be very aware of that. And this is why we tend to lean away from Imazapyr in most natural areas in general, because we do not want that non-target injury, and why we tend to limit its use to silvicultural, to pine plantations in general. Okay, number 4, and this is the most important one probably for triclopyr ester, is volatility on hot days, where it goes from the tree trunks itself. volatilizes, converts to a vapor, and is then distributed and moves through the air currents with the wind directly and lands on other trees where it can cause significant injury. So that is real, and we've seen plenty of that. These are the types of symptoms that you may see. These were taken really close to a treated tree, and so what you can see is there was definitely something going on there, and we saw some very close by damage from volatility. Okay. Now, what about this situation where we're controlling vines on desirable trees? This is a tough one. Can you do basal bark on this? Technically you can, but I don't recommend it in a situation like this, because you're going to be putting way too much herbicide there, and there's a good chance this tree is going to end up picking up quite a bit of that herbicide. So it's tricky. Be very careful. It's where I tend to move to a cut stump type treatment to avoid heavy triclopyr applications right around the base of desirable trees. Okay, so we have covered a lot in the last hour. I hope I've given you a little bit more of a true deep dive onto the different questions that inevitably come up when you get into triclopyr, imazapyr, basal bark applications, and other herbicides. If you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. This is Belle Bergner, Executive Director of NASEMA, and unfortunately we are past the hour, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We won't go through any of the questions that were posed in the question box right now, but as Stephen said, please send him an email, reach out to him, and we will also download all of the questions and post them with the video that is in NASEMA's member resource area. If you are not a NASEMA member, I'm going to show you how to get there. Give me just a second to move over there. Let's see, I want to go. Okay, let's try that. Okay, so again, so we have a whole a range of webinars that we've hosted over the last year and a half or so. It's a great resource. So if you are not a member, hop on over to NASEMA's website, nasema.org, click on the membership tab. There's a variety of options, whether you want an individual membership or one for your organization that provides more benefits for your organization. There are lots of options. And finally, a plug for more of these great resources. We're going to have a fantastic conference this fall, assuming we are back to life as normal after this coronavirus situation. Hopefully we'll all be ready for a great time to be together. So here's the save the date for that. And with that, again, thank you so much, everyone, for being here today, taking time out of your busy schedules. And thank you, Stephen, for this fantastic webinar. With that, have a great rest of the week, everyone, and we'll see you next month for NASEMA's next webinar.
And I do promise to get your questions answered. I've still got questions to answer from the last triclopyr webinar, but I will get those taken care of this next week.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of the week. Bye-bye.